Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking. Today we're going to talk about the Gladiators. Now I know that you noble ones were waiting for this one, because I know that the Gladiators are a very popular topic, something that people want to talk about. And yes, this is Andorial and it has nothing to do with this video. It's here because it looks good and I think I'll keep it. Anyhow, most people have an overall understanding of who the gladiators were and what they were doing, fighting to entertain people. And so this is not really a historical video about specifically who the gladiators were. I might make one for that, but this is a video about something that most people don't know much about, and that is the different types or classes of gladiators that there were during the times of Rome and the Colosseum. When I say classes, the first thing that people think is video games, of course, because when you play a video game or a role-playing game, you need to choose your class, which will influence your fighting and combat style and also the kind of equipment that you can use. Well, that's pretty much a very similar concept for gladiators. As a matter of fact, if we think about it, the gladiators were a form of entertainment for the ancient Romans. So we could say that in a way, the gladiators were a kind of game. Of course, rather bloody, but still a game. So, these different kinds and types and classes of gladiators, and there were a lot of different kinds of classes, and they all had different kinds of equipment and different ways of fighting. But most importantly, you couldn't just take a couple of random classes of types of gladiators and put them in the arena, put them in the Colosseum to fight. No, you actually had specific opponents. A class would normally fight against another class or maybe two. They were like sworn enemies, like this class fights against this class and so forth. And actually the kind of equipment that they had most of the times was specialized against a specific kind of class. So we will be talking about this. I'd like to cover all the main and major classes that there were during ancient times, during the times of the gladiators. For the minor classes for now, the less common one, the less known, I will not cover them in this video because it would be too long, but I will see if I get enough comments and views and maybe likes in this video and you want me to talk about the other kind of classes not many people know about, then I will. But for now, let's begin talking about the gladiator classes. The Thrax, or Thracian in English. This is a kind of gladiator who was representing a warrior coming from Thracia, or the modern-day Bulgaria. The Thracian is an agile kind of gladiator, more of an attacker rather than a defender. Now, when we see the equipment, obviously the first thing that strikes the eye is the helmet. Now, helmets for Thracians were full helmets, as you can see. Most of the times, they would completely cover also the face, with possibly one or two variations, like, for example, just with holes in front of the eyes in a circular shape, or with a complete gate-like face protection. Now, continuing to talk about the kind of equipment, the gear of a Thrax, of a Thracian. The first thing is the arm, the protected arm. It would only be the right arm, so the arm armed with a sword, and it would be completely covered. First, they would wrap it up with bandages, basically, and then they would put on it a metal sleeve. Now, similarly, in a similar way, they would wrap up the thighs and also the legs. Now, on top of the legs, they would also be wearing, the Thrax would be wearing two greaves, metal greaves, that would be basically placed on top of the bandage that they were using to wrap up the, normally used also with wool. Sometimes they would use wool also to kind of give a certain degree of padding for comfort, obviously, but the feet would be left completely unprotected. Now, the protection of the greaves would be for knees and the shin. As far as the thighs are concerned, sometimes they use metal, but most of the times they use leather. The shield would be a small shield, a more rectangular shield, and the sword that they would use, the kind of weapon that a Thracian would use, would be a sica, or to be more precise, a sica supina, which was a kind of short sword which would be curved at the point. And so basically the point would be out of angle. And the reason for that was to be able to attack the opponent on the sides or in the back. The most common opponent for a Thrax would be the Murmillo. Now, in terms of gaming, I would say that a Thrax would basically be a close quarter light DPS class. Murmillo. Now, the Murmillo or Murmillo was basically the heaviest kind of gladiator as far as armor and weight were concerned, but also as far as the fighting style was concerned. Now, in order to become a Murmillo, you needed to be a very strong and tough warrior, like with a very strong body, in order to become one of these. So, as far as the equipment is concerned, the helmet, now, helmets of gladiators sometimes might be a little confusing, because occasionally they may be similar. As a matter of fact, one of the possible versions of the Murmillo's helmet was kind of similar to the Thrax, but the difference is that we would have marine representations, because basically every gladiator, every kind of gladiator, had a kind of symbolic representation, was a kind of a symbolic representation of specific kind of lore, of Roman myths, like mythology. So in this case, marine figures would be, if you see marine figures on, for example, helmets, then it would be a Murmillo. Now, as far as the equipment is concerned, then they had this big kind of helmet. Other times it would be different from the Thrax, because you would have actually bigger versions, like with really high tops and very, very heavy armored helmets. Now, other things that we have, they had a very big scutum, a very big shield, which was actually, the equipment they had, the gear they had of a Murmillo would be similar to the gear of a Roman soldier. So it would have very big shield that they would use to defend themselves. This is a defender class, very different from the Thrax and other attack-based classes, and they would use the Gladius. So again, very similar to a legionary. Now, as far as the legs are concerned, another very important point is that they only used one greave instead of two, and it was always on the left leg, which was the leg in front. As far as but both legs would be normally wrapped up with either wool or anyway some kind of bandage for protection. So the only weapon again would be the Gladius. The opponent to the Murmillo would be the Thrax, and that is, as I said before, and since basically a Murmillo was almost impossible to hit from the front, and that's why the Thrax was equipped in order to try and attack him on the sides and the back. So a Murmillo, on the other hand, would be a very strong and tough and heavy armored kind of gladiator. So from a gaming point of view, this would definitely be a tank. The Retiarius. The Retiarius literally means man with a net, or the fighter of the net, and his equipment was similar to that of a fisherman. Basically what he had was, his main weapon were a trident and a net, but the net that they were using in combat also was provided with weights, so that it wouldn't be easy to take it off if you were caught in it during fight. Also, apart from the trident, which was his main weapon, he also used a dagger, which was called pugio. Now, as far as the armor is concerned, the Retiarius was using a very light kind of equipment, a very light kind of gear. Only the left arm, the one using the net, was protected, and it was protected with two things. One was a long sleeve protecting the whole forearm, and then he would use what is called in Latin a galerus, which was a very big pauldron, which would protect the left shoulder. Apart from that, the Retiarius was also wearing a linen kind of garment of clothing called sublicaculum. The Retiarius was normally wearing no helmet and was having and had no kinds of protections for the legs. The Retiarius historically appeared for the first time in the arena in the 1st century. In the arena, the opponent of a Retiarius would be the Secutor. For those of you who like gaming, I would say that Retiarius would be a mid-quarter special DPS class, lightly armored. The Secutor, or Chaser, or Pursuer in English. Now this kind of gladiator, together with the Murmillo, was basically the standard opponent of the Retiarius. As a matter of fact, another way to call the Secutor was the Contra Retiarius, so the counter Retiarius. Now, talking about the equipment of a Secutor, first of all, the first thing is obviously the helmet here. Very heavy helmet, either made of iron or bronze. The helmet was rounded and with a thin and tall crest. Now, the reason for this choice is because the helmet was supposed to confront the Retiarius net. So a very rounded helmet would have made it difficult for the Retiarius net to actually grab onto it. So this was a very good, very effective helmet, considering that it needed to fight against the Retiarius. But some of the disadvantages of this helmet were the fact that it was very heavy, although inside the helmet it would have a kind of a lining of leather for comfort. But another problem would be ventilation, because it was very well fitted to the head of the wearer, and vision, because it only had 2 small holes from which the gladiator could actually see. For better protection, obviously. With the shield, we have a similar situation. The shield is very big, similar to the Murmillo's shield, but the difference is that the edges of the shield used by the Secutor were rounded, again for the same reason, in order to oppose the Retiarius net. For the armor, we see that he had some kind of protection for a sleeve protection with metal plates or leather plates, depending on the situation and also the era we are talking about. Now, this one would limit movement to a certain degree, because again, this is one of the heavy kind of types or classes of gladiators. But we was normally used to cover the right arm, so the striking arm, so that when the Secutor would strike, his arm would be protected. Now, as far as the protection of the shoulders is concerned, Secutors would normally wear either metal pauldrons, or kind of plate protections, or leather, but most of the times it would be leather protections. The legs, the shins, were also protected by metal greaves. Underneath these greaves, we would have wrapping of woolen wrappings, or wrapping of wool, to provide some kind of padding protection. The weapon used by a Secutor was a Gladius, and that's where the gladiators got their name from, and it was the same weapon that was used and chosen by the legionaries. So again, for my gamers friends, this is another kind of tank, but a specialized tank to face Retiarius. So probably slightly less effective than the Murmillo from other kind of opponents, but very effective against Retiarius. Oplomachus. Now, the Oplomachus is a very interesting gladiator type. It sometimes was used as an alternative, because as we said before, the classical and traditional fight was between a Murmillo and a Thrax, but occasionally we also had Murmillo against or versus Oplomachus. So what was the difference between an Oplomachus and a Thrax? Well, the defensing and armor equipment would be very similar to that of a Thrax. So the difference is the shield and the weapon. So the shield, as you can see, would be a rounded shield, very light, and also the weapon would be a lance, the asta. So basically the idea in the mind of ancient Romans, particularly the spectators, would be that the Oplomachus would represent a Greek hoplite. That's what it would represent. He also had, though, in his equipment a secondary weapon, which was the Gladius. So there could be situations in which he would fight with, if he lost, for example, the spear, the lance, then he would be fighting. You would see an Oplomachus fighting with shield and sword and shield. Now there were also rare occasions where an Oplomachus fought a Thrax, and that would also be an interesting fight to see, I think. Now, the right arm and the legs of an Oplomachus were very well protected. The legs were wrapped and protected by 2 heavy greaves, so it would be still considered as a heavy armored gladiator. for you, my friend gamers, I would say that definitely the Oplomachus would be in the era, in the times of the gladiators, in the world of the gladiators, he would be considered as a high-range DPS class. The Scissor. Now, the Scissor was a rare kind of gladiator. It doesn't appear a lot in history, but it did happen sometimes to have Scissors in the arena. So what the Scissor was another possible opponent to the Retiarius. Now, normally the Scissor was used as a support to Secutores against Retiarii. So, and as you can see, as a matter of fact, the helmet would be very similar to that of a Secutor. So normally you could even have a Secutor and a Scissor against Retiarii. Now, if you look at the equipment, this is a very interesting one, I think, because again the helmet is the same as the Secutor, so optimized against Retiarius, but the fact this kind of gladiator did not have a shield, so no movable defense. Instead of the shield, we have this very curious weapon that I'm going to describe in a minute now. But it's interesting because basically this kind of gladiators would give up defense in order to get a stronger attack. So the left hand had this very long metal tube that would cover the forearm, so it could be used to defend in a way, for example against the attacks with a trident from a Retiarius. But at the end of the left arm, we would have this half moon shaped, very sharp blade. Now this was used for two purposes: either cutting the neck of the Retiarius or slaughtering the opponent, because it was very dangerous. Now, the right arm would be protected by a sleeve, like other gladiators, and he would either use a gladius or a sika, depending on the situation. Interestingly enough, considering that this class did not use, this type of gladiators did not use a shield, they were actually allowed to wear lorica, and so the armor, and most of the times it would be either a lorica amata or a lorica squamata, so we are talking about either mail or scale armor, and this armor would actually protect them until almost the knees, so it would be similar to a hauberk. So very interesting class, and I think that this would have been a very tough opponent to fight against, and very scary, I have to say. For you gamers, I think this is kind of an interesting class because it's in between a support class, because it's highly specialized against Retiarius to help a Secutor. So yeah, I would consider it definitely a support. The Provocateur. The Provocateur is a very old kind of gladiator. We see examples of Provocateurs already during the times of the Republic, so before the Empire. Now, normally this class was a bit special because it was normally fighting against the same, so a Provocateur versus a Provocator. Now, the equipment of a Provocator would vary depending on what era we're talking about, so I will try to cover both kinds of equipment. Now, if we are talking about the 1st century before Christ until the 1st century after Christ, then if you were there as a spectator and you would look and see a Provocator, you would basically see a gladiator looking very similar to a legionary, because they would wear the same kind of galea, the same kind of helmet that a legionary was wearing, and then they would use a gladius and a scutum. Now, the helmet changed after the 2nd century after Christ until the 3rd century after Christ, because that's when the helmet became completely closed and would be protecting also the face. Now, the name of the Provocator was originated from the Latin verb provocare, which in the military language, the sermo castrensis, it meant a legionary which was wearing light armor, and so it was very movable. It was very it was easy to take him and move him within the battlefield. So it was basically a skirmisher, a kind of legionary that could attack and then come back very quickly. So as far as the gladiators were concerned, the Provocator were used as the first, like a warming up kind of gladiator to warm up the spectators. So the first fights, the first duels that we had in the arena would be Provocators fighting one against the other. Now, differently from a legionary, they would have a sleeve on the right arm, as many other gladiators, and only one. They would actually have protections for the shins, but only one. So they would have one greave on the left leg. So the leg that would stay normally in front in a fighting stance. As far as the chest was concerned, they were not wearing lorica segmentata nor lorica amata, so from this point of view they would vary from a legionary, but they would wear a kind of protection, of armor called pectorale, which was a kind of a half-moon shaped protection for the bosom. So a breastplate, basically half a breastplate, which was actually, I think it would be close in between a gorget and a breastplate. So, from a gaming point of view, I think that the Provocateur would be a medium armoured skirmisher class. The Dima Kairos. The name Dima Kairos comes from two words. The first one, di, which normally represents the idea of two, and then makeros, which basically were short swords. So this is a attacker among all gladiators who used two swords, no shield. Now, the two swords that he was using most of the times would be two different swords. One would be a sika, so a short sword, bent, as I said, a bent short sword. And the other one would be a normal sword, so a straight sword of either between 16 to 18 inches of length. Okay, so he would use both to attack his opponent. Now, as far as the armor and protection is concerned, he would have a sleeve, mostly on the right side, or on the right arm, protecting sleeve, the manica, and he would have wrapping around the shins, so around the legs. And sometimes they would be wearing greaves, most of the times leather greaves. Also, they would be wearing subrigaculum, which I have already mentioned before, which was the kind of linen garment that some gladiators were using. And then some of these Dima Kairos would fight with bare feet, another would use sandals. The helmet would be a light helmet with a full visor. Now, we only have, for this kind of gladiator, we only have two historical accounts. So we're not 100% sure about the rest of the equipment. We don't even know how much of a historical kind of gladiator this actually was. It could have also been just a special thing that occurred a couple of times. We don't know much about this. So for you gamers out there, this would be the full DPS class of the actual attacker with light armor and completely close quarter combat attacker DPS class. Alright then, I hope you liked this video. If you did, please thumb up, support my channel, help me grow, share this video with your friends, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. See you soon.